users. So sometimes uniquely identify the users, and it's called user ID and password are there for the purpose of to identify the user. Sometimes users can select their IDs and long it given to another user. So users should be sometimes select their IDs and longer he can given the access to the another users. So user is very important, that user should be given the access, and he can support it to that access. So user ID is there. So what is user ID? User ID have username. Suppose you have to provide the user ID to the computer student, IT student, sorry. So username is there, your student name, then you can use the roll number also. So criteria should be the student roll number, either student name, others names, and the last name, or the you have to use the your phone numbers. So these are the criteria for the identification of the users, that whether this user should be legal or not, that should be identified into the system, that user ID is correct or not. The username is there, user student number is there, and user SSN number. So this is very important for the identification. Now after the identified the network, then only we can provide the authentication to the user. So what do you mean by the authentication? That what user should be provided what security. So process of verifying the identity of the user typically based on something, the user's password, the identification of the network. Authentications of the network should be depends on the which kind of password, that is the privilege level 1, 2, 3. Different privilege level are there. So that privilege level we can support the password. Sometimes the users need the password. Sometimes user have some keys, smart cards, disk, and other devices are there. So this is very important, that what are the keys are provided to the computer, whether it is smart card, whether it is disk or other devices is there. That should be considered. Something to the users. So password will be given in terms of fingerprint, voice, and retina scanner. You know that fingerprint generally some laptop or the mobile present day, they can be given a fingerprint as a scanner password, that you have to don't enter the text message or the any voice message. We have to just click onto the finger on the mobile, and that mobile should be open now. That should be everybody is known. Fingerprint concept everybody know now? Yes. Hello.
Yes, sir.
So we have to given the voice password also. Voice as a password, that if encrypted message or voice of the computer or voice of the user should be given as a password. Now suppose we can speak into the Google, and then that mobiles or anything should, or your Windows should be open in the given system. So you know that a voice should be also as a password for the purpose of sometimes users. Now some users have the actual password should be. So what do you mean by the password? Password should be used as an encrypted form data that should be for the purpose of finding the authentication or whether your computer is right or not. So what is the password giving methods? For the purpose of the encryption or decryption purpose, the password should be always into the encrypted form, then it should be decrypted into the other side. So what is encryption and decryption we can see into the lateral slide, but password we have to given that your mobile number as a password, then it is a combination of your first name, second name, and the special symbol. So these are the criteria. Sometimes you have to given the different criteria password to the network, and that should be very essential for the networking system, that you have to use the different password for the different purpose. Then sometimes users have some keys or smart card or the disk or the other devices is given as a sometimes users should be use the different keys, that is secret key, that public or private keys for the purpose of users have. Then smart cards is there. Smart cards are the very essential for the purpose. So next is the disk is there. This should be is the physical or the logical disk are there in the database system. You know, better way know that this thing, that how the sometimes users should be have the use records for the purpose of the devices. Sometimes user have used the fingerprint, voice and retina. Now what is the retina? In the Bluetooth technology, your eyes or your biological part should be used as a password. You know that retina, eye retina, you know that into the computer system, your biological way, that is maybe the eye retina, maybe fingerprint, or maybe your logical or your any body part should be used for the purpose of given the input to the user, and then that should be used the password. So everybody understand authentication? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So authentication have the two way, general access authentication and the functional authentication. To control where or not a particular users have any type of access right to the element questions. Usually we consider these in the forms of user account. So general access authentication is there and functional authentication is there. Now general access authentications to control whether or not particular users have any type of access right. Access right is that whether user account number, login ID and password in this method. So particular users have any type of access right to the element questions. Usually we consider these in the form of user account. User account, if you go into the user account, then you have to use the whether that is admin, whether that is student, whether that is HOD, then whether that is principal. So that used for the purpose that two sub-way conflict, that is two important authentication, general access authentications and the functional authentications. Now for this purpose, user account will be given. Now network administrator, it is the role of network administrator, it's not anybody should. That if you are the student, you have the different access. If you are the class teacher, you have the different access. Then if you have the any mentor, that should be depend on to the different type of privilege should be given the different user account. So authentication is very general authentication to control the particular way in this manner. Suppose HODs should be give the authentication to control over the staff. They have the different authentication. Then principal should be the centralized person who can be access all these HODs, and then these HODs authentication should be decided. In this purpose, that topmost authentication should be given to the principal sir. Then the authentication is given to the all HODs. After the HOD, the authentication is given to the all staff, and after the staff, the authentication is given to the class teacher. After the class teacher, it should be given to the different student, different authentication. So this is a usual hierarchies of giving the authentication to the every portfolio. So everybody understand this? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So general access authentication, you are understand. Then functional authentication, concerned with the individual's users, right? What, for the example, can users do when the authentication can they have the figure the devices or only see the data? Now, what do you mean by the functional authentication? That should be given briefly here. We have to give the different functionality, and according to this functionality, authentication should be work. Concerned with the individual user's right, user right is given. That should be the functional user right. What are the example? Can user do authentications? Authentications, you know that computer, we have to use the admin, or admin have the different privilege, then the student have the different privilege. So privilege is there, is privilege. We use the word either privilege or either functional. So functional authentication is very important. What are the example you can users do authentication? Can they figure the device or only see the data? So that should be very important, that it should be either figure the devices or only they can see the data. Now, this is the protocol, mainly username or password. Features is that either it can be used the plain text or the memorized token is there. These have the certain protocol is there, that telnet or HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol, that should be used here. Then next is the CHAP, challenge handshake authentication protocol. Features of challenge handshake acceptable protocol is user hashes of password and time variant data, avoid a straight password transmission. Now, protocol used for this, it is MS-CHAP. CHAP is challengeable handshake authentication protocol. Then triple P is there. Then APC, HTTP. Then Radius is there. Now, what is the Radius protocol? Radius protocol have the features like a CHAP or a straight password authentications and accounting methods are there. Then next is the backend or the telnet protocol. Users of Radius protocol is that backend or the telnet. Then secure server, SSH is the secure server layer, and the secure server hierarchies are there. Front end or Microsoft IS server. Then typical central authentication method for the network devices. So everybody understand? Hello.
Yes, sir.
So Radius is very important. First is first protocol user and accept purpose. We have to use the telnet or HTTP or the CHAP, challengeable handshake authentication protocol. We have to use the MS CHAP and triple P. Then APC, HTTP. Then Radius. In this manner, now Radius have given CHAP or the state password authentications or the according method. Now protocol used is that backend or the telnet or secure server host or secure server layer, front end on the Microsoft IS server, and typical central authentication method for the network devices. Now next is the TACACS. Now authentications, authentications or the authorizations, accounting, full encrypt support will be given to this feature TACACS. Now protocol uses is used for the Cisco protocol. Cisco is the one side which can be work onto the computer network. Central authentication, some remote access services. To remote access services, for this purpose we have to use the Cisco protocol or the central authentications or RAS. RAS is the remote access services. Now next is the KRBROS, this ROS. The features of CurveOS is the service authentications and authentications and full encryption is there. Now, protocol use of these are the name of protocols. Understand, student? These are the name of protocols. Then the feature is given here into this table, and the protocol use should be given into the third row. So everybody should understand this. Everybody should understand this. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we can go for the next slide. Now, next slide should be the authentication procedure. Authentication procedure are the two-way party authentication, one-way authentications, or the two-way authentications, or third-party authentications, or it should be have the single one. So we know that authentication procedure have the one-way authentication, or two-way authentication, or the third-party authentications. Now, one-way authentication and two-way authentication is there. One-way authentication means that only one side is given the access and other should be ideal one. Two-way authentication means that both the party just have the given the authentication for the both the parties. Third-party authentication is such that three parties are there. Party suppose PC1, then metropolitan area networks and wide area network. So the access should be given to all these parties. This is called the third party authentication. Now this is a block diagram of party authentications. We can understand the one-way authentication. One-way authentication means that just your client is there and your personal is there. Only user ID and password should be given into the one party authentication. But in case of two party authentication, one way authentication means that either you can given the server is the central machine and the personal computer is the one machine. Only one way will be for the purpose of the authentication. So client is there and server is there. Now consider the client should be give the user ID and password to the server, and authentication is always given. That is, privilege should be given onto the server side or server side purpose. In this matter, server side IDs are there and password is there on the server. So you know that authentication plays a very important role. It should be the client side authentication or it should be the server side authentication. In this manner, we have to understand what is the way or what is the one-way authentication. Everybody should understand what is one-way authentication. Simply we have to give the procedural data in only server, and then you can get the access onto the client. And in case of the two-way authentication, you have to give the client, then central server is there. The user ID and password should be understood by the server, and then the data should be fetched from that server by the necessary client. Everybody understand? Hello, everybody understand?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so client is there and server is there. User ID and password should be generated from the server side. That authentication should be provided to the client in the client machine. The server ID and password. Though for the purpose of giving the server side authentication, the server's ID should be there and the password should be required. Now, if it is authenticate, then that authentication should be provided to the client side. That is called the two-way authentication. Two-way communication, you know that communication have the two types, that one-way communication and the two-way communication. Now I am teaching and you are just listening. This is called the one-way communication, but you are also taken part in my communication. Then it is called the two-way communication. In similar way, the network have the similar concept that it should be have used the same user ID and password and take the authenticate that user ID and password onto the network server and send the reply or the acknowledgement mail to the client. In this method, here is the survey and password should be generated, and that acknowledgement should be given to the site. These are the two-way authentication. Now, let us consider this block diagram. Authentication procedure. Now, let us consider this authentication procedure. Client have the client ID and password authentically sent onto the security server. Now, security server will be intermediate in the form of so server ID and server password is there. Now authentication should be given functions. So authentication part very important. So it is necessary you to understand these authentication. We can study authorization. Now authentication part we can see into the next lecture. What is the authentication is given to the any server that should be we have to study into the